Quebec is currently in its provincial election campaign, but this race is different from the others because there is a grassroots conservative movement taking place in a province known for its liberal politics. The Conservative Party of Quebec, which has existed since 2009, was once a very small party that only received 1.46% of the votes in the last general election in Quebec. However, the party has since grown from 500 to 60,000 members, receiving up to 24% in the polls, placing second in some polls, and having a few seats coming up in the seat projections. The party saw these positive changes under its new leader, Eric Duhaime, who was previously known in the province as a radio host and columnist. Duhaime has been quite popular due to the fact that he was one of the only opposition leaders to oppose the government COVID mandates and restrictions, which were particularly harsh in Quebec. I had the opportunity to catch up with Eric Duhaime while he was on his campaign bus, touring the province to speak to Quebecers, to talk about the platform Liberty 22, which the party has released, as well as other issues that face Quebecers. All right, so Mr. Duhaime, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So you previously were a radio personality and you had columns, and now you are running to be Premier of Quebec as leader of the Conservative Party of Quebec. So what made you decide to make the jump from, talking politics to doing politics by getting involved the way that you have?
Well, I voted for François Legault in the last provincial election. I thought that he wanted to downsize the state in Quebec. He promised us that he would cut 5,000 bureaucrats. He told us that he would improve our healthcare system. He told us all sorts of things that sounded very attractive. That he would reduce the waiting lists for healthcare, for kindergartens. He told us that he would exploit our natural resources. He was a big fan of exploiting oil and gas in Quebec. And then he arrived in power and completely switched. So I have the impression that he was flashing on the right when it was election time, and he's been turning on the left since he got elected. So for me, this is unacceptable. And we saw it also during the crisis, the pandemic. He also took stands that were, for me, outrageous, and he deprived many Quebecers of their democratic rights, their civic rights, and their individual freedoms. And he did put our democracy on pause for over 2 years. So that for me was just way too much. So I decided to run for a party that was very small at the beginning. When I took the leadership of the party, we had 500 members. Today, we're the largest party with 60,000 members. We're now at, 20%? And according to certain polls, we went from 1 to 20%, and it keeps going up. So we're very excited. There is a momentum. There is something going on. We had a very good week for the first week of the campaign, and hopefully we'll have a very good week this week as well.
Right, and for sure, your party has grown tremendously since you became leader, and since you were one of the only opposition leaders in all of Canada to speak out against these very strong COVID measures that many say infringed on personal liberties and freedoms. While these mandates are hopefully behind us, I mean, in Quebec, I was there yesterday, and nobody wears masks. It looks pretty much normal. There are still other overreaching COVID policies, especially in the private sector and in other institutions. We've seen some universities, at least in Ontario, mandate boosters, for example. And in others like sports teams, maybe that affect children. As Premier, would you seek to ban all discrimination based on COVID vaccination status?
Well, I've been a big critic of it from day one, especially if the vaccine, was protecting us 100% and we couldn't transmit it or catch it when we were vaccinated, we would have a completely different debate. But right now, as we know, it doesn't deprive us from catching it. So why are we discriminating? So it seems that it's kind of a revenge by the government to penalize those who didn't behave properly according to his own standards. And that's what's very shocking. And, when you want to impose such strict discriminatory measures, you need to have a scientific proof that it's an absolute necessity. And we never had that proof. It's the opposite. We have no studies. We deprive people from their basic freedoms without very little evidence, when any. Like here in Quebec, as you know, we had curfews. We're still waiting for the first study to show us that putting people in the public place only a few hours a day altogether, being more crowded, is better than extended it over 24 hours a day. We've never ever had a proof. When we asked for some scientific proof, the premier came out with a poll. I'm sorry, but the methodology of the poll might be scientific, but a poll is not science. A poll is politics. And we've been governed by politics from day one during this crisis. It's always been very confusing. Mr. Legault was surrounded by 17 advisors. We called it his cellule de crise, his crisis team, and out of those 17, only one was a physician, a scientific. 15 out of 17 were people who were political apparatchiks, former chiefs of staffs, former politicians, or himself. It was all political. Their first purpose was to make sure François Legault would get reelected. And that's not science. So we want to be governed by science, not by politics, or at least we can figure out when a politician is speaking and when a scientific is speaking. And right now we had a huge confusion over the last few months in Quebec.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, staying on healthcare, the pandemic did bring to light several problems with the single-payer public healthcare system, which has been plagued for other issues for years, but now we've seen it really being a total mess. So you're proposing to increase the role of the private sector in healthcare, something that's quite bold in Canadian politics. So can you explain a bit what your healthcare plan with privatization would look like and why it's not something that Quebecers should fear?
First off, we want to make sure that we improve our healthcare system. It's been 40 years in Quebec that we went from one health minister to another, from one premier to another, with all sorts of reforms. And at the end of the day, our system is less and less and less efficient. And we think that it's time to open up to the private sector. It's time to have some competition within the system. We looked at several models. We saw that the most performing models were in Europe. We looked at, for example, the Swedish model, the German model. We do believe that there could be a private hospital next to a public hospital. And if the government is not able to provide you with these public facilities, the services that you need within reasonable delays, you should be able to cross the street and go to a private facility and be reimbursed by the public insurance. We want to save the universal system that we currently have. We want to respect the Canadian Health Act, but we want to make sure that there's nothing that deprives us from having private providers of services. And if the private sector is also able to do it for cheaper than the public, which is quite possible, and that's what happened in Europe in many places, well, then you don't even have to wait for a reasonable delay. You can choose to go to the private sector right away. So we're going to increase the services, the quality, and we do believe that competition is always leading to a better model than a public monopoly. And just a monopoly is a monopoly, no matter if it's public or private. Usually it doesn't, defend consumers, patients, or students. A monopoly is no good, and we want to make sure we have competition, and we're going to open up the door to add the contribution of the private sector.
So let's talk about taxes, which are known to be high in Quebec. You are proposing tax cuts that would save someone with an annual income of $80,000 a year around $2,000, in addition to suspending the gas tax, abolishing taxes on second-hand items, and a progressive reduction of payroll taxes. The Liberals and the CAQ are also promising tax cuts. So can you explain what's different about your tax plan compared to theirs? And if you also plan to balance the budget in addition to lowering taxes?
Well, there's several things I need to say here. First off, our tax cuts are much more generous than all the other parties together. We want to increase the first $15,000 that you earn currently in Quebec is not taxable. We want to increase that to $20,000. Then from $20,000 to $92,000, we want to lower the bracket by 2%, which means it's like between $2,000 and $4,000 for an average family in Quebec that we're going to give them back every single year. How are we going to fund that? Unlike the others, we're not going to impoverish the next generation. The Liberals are proposing two things. They're proposing to increase taxes for people who make more money. So it's a tax grab there. And also increase the deficit. So shuffle that on the back of the next generation. Mr. Legault wants to fund his tax cuts by going in le Fonds des Générations, which is a fund that is put aside for the next generation. So he wants to indebt the next generation to buy the next election. And we think that's totally irresponsible. What we're proposing as conservatives is first off to increase the revenues of the state by exploiting our oil and gas in Quebec. We do believe that there's a huge potential there, especially with the crisis in Europe right now. We do believe that we could make a lot of money if we have, for example, natural liquefied gas. And we also, so that's the first and a new source of income. The second thing is we want to stop to subsidize the multinationals like the government does. Quebec is very generous in subsidizing huge businesses. We want to stop that. We do not believe that it's the role of the state to choose winners and losers among private companies. There's a lot of small businesses in Quebec who don't have the money to hire lobbyists to go after the government and after the minister and their cocktails and to try to get a few checks here and there. So that needs to end. And the third thing is we want to make sure that it's the government that is going to squeeze himself during while we're in an inflation economy, because not the average families. To give them a break, we need to downsize the role of the state. François Legault promised to cut 5,000 bureaucrats when he ran last election. He did the exact opposite. He increased the state like crazy over the last 4 years. We do believe it's time to downsize the state, so we're also going to do cuts in the fat of the government. So those are the three sources of revenue to fund our tax cuts.
Right. So I often travel to Quebec. I was there this weekend, and there's signs everywhere saying we are hiring. A labor shortage, and there's a lot of more signs saying businesses reducing their hours, so they're not making as much money as they used to because they can't have staff. And this is after 2 years of government restriction that prohibited them from operating at full capacity. What are you proposing to address this critical issue? Because politicians often like to talk about creating jobs, but right now it seems that it's not the jobs that are needed, but the people to fill them.
It's a very good question. There's several things we can do. As I just pointed out, if the government stops hiring more bureaucrats, and there will be more people available on the market. So that's one source of new employees. The second one is the seniors. There's 15% of people who are retired right now who would like to work, but there's no incentive because many of them feel that their pension is cut so badly that they're working for nothing because they're changing their brackets, right? So we want to increase to double the credits, the tax credits for the 60 to 64 years old and triple for 65 years older. So that would be very good to have, and they don't need to come to work 5 days a week. They could work a day or two. That's going to give a hand to everybody. They have experience. They could be mentors in what they do. So we do believe that's another solution. The third one is all the immigration thing. The bureaucracy is just awful. Just for seasoned workers, for example, it could take a year or two right now in Quebec to get your seasoned worker because there's a duplication between the federal government and the provincial government. There's all sorts of papers that you need to fill. I spoke to a lot of businesses or farms that are telling me it takes them, it costs them up to $15,000, $10,000 to $15,000. They have to hire experts just to fill papers with the government and make sure they follow the process. And even then, it takes months and months and months. We need to downsize that badly. So those are our three examples of where we could solve in part the problem with the lack of employees right now.
Right. I do want to talk about children and education. We've seen this summer in Quebec and also the rest of Canada, drag queens going into libraries to read stories to very small children in the name of inclusivity. While in North America, some activists are also pushing for something called critical race theory to be taught in school. So where does the Conservative Party of Quebec stand on things like progressive sexual or education for primary students, as well as teaching the students about concepts such as systemic racism and white privilege?
To be very honest, we didn't talk about it at our convention when we adopted our program. It was not part of the discussion or the debates. That being said, we did adopt positions that are very clearly against those woke pushes. The Conservative Party, for example, wants also reinstall, especially among campuses of colleges and universities, the freedom of speech, because as you know, the cancel culture is very present here. Unfortunately, we inherited that from English Canada and even from the States, and that's a huge problem right now. A lot of people can't express themselves if they're not on the radical left, and that's totally unacceptable in public institutions.
Yeah, for sure. And we see it, this importation from the US into Quebec and other non-Anglophone cultures, and it to tackle, and it's so important, I think, to push back against that. So you have accused Premier François Legault of dividing Quebecers amongst essential and non-essential, vaccinated and unvaccinated, and francophone and anglophone. It is true that Canadian society as a whole is getting more polarized and divided. So what would you do to heal some of these divides in Quebec? Because there are today noticeable differences between your typical Montreal anglophone and French-speaking rural and suburban Quebecers.
But we have to stop looking at Anglophones as enemies. François Legault has a negative nationalism. I think we should have an inclusive, a positive nationalism. Anglophones have changed tremendously in Quebec. 75% of Anglophone parents right now in Quebec send their kids to French schools, bilingual schools, or French immersion program schools. We're far away from people who want to impose their language and refuse to speak French here. And so we should commend that. And yes, there is a decline of French, and we should be very cautious about that. Statistics Canada showed us some data lately that was scary. But why is it? It's not because Anglophones, it's not the fault of Anglophones, and it's not even the fault of Francophones, because Francophones are not assimilating to French. It's the fact that our immigration is more and more, English. And that's something we need to control better. I think we should give some incentives to new immigrants to make sure that they could learn French faster and better. So that's our job as Quebecers. And Anglophones are not going to be against us. They're with us. We have to see them as allies. Montreal is the most bilingual city in North America. It shouldn't be a source of discord. It should be a source of pride. It should be a source of richness and to attract businesses, to attract people. Unfortunately, it's not been like that over the last few years. And Mr. Legault adopted a bill, Bill 96, to poke Anglophones and to try to wedge, because he wants the Parti Québécois voters to vote for him, because we know that the Parti Québécois is very, very low in the polls, and it seems that Mr. Legault wants to finish them off. And it's a political purpose, because when you look at the bill, it's not going to change that much. The French in Quebec is not better protected today because he adopted Bill 96. The only thing that changed is that Anglophones are furious right now for good reasons. We're depriving them from their basic rights, from 38 articles of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms of Quebec, and that for us is unacceptable. And talking about that, we have to also underline the Liberals, or even worse, they proposed amendments to the bill that would have made it even worse. And before they realized that the Anglophones saw what they were doing, and they had to flip-flop badly and lose face. So the Liberals, we can't trust the Liberals. They betrayed the Anglophone community on that bill especially. And only the Conservative Party stood up and have always the same position on it. And we're going to protect all Quebecers. And that being said, I also have to underline the debate. As you know, 4 years ago, there was a debate in English in Quebec. Unfortunately, this year, it seems that there's going to be no debate because Mr. Legault, who was at the debate 4 years ago, decided that he didn't have time this year to talk to Anglophones. There's 1 million people, and Mr. Legault thinks it's not important to talk to those people. That's another example how polarizing he is, how divisive he is. Why did he change his mind? Why did he flip-flop from 4 years ago? It's questions that, unfortunately, we don't have an answer right now.
For sure, and talking about Anglophone leads perfectly into my next question. So a lot of Anglophones in Quebec, including those with conservative values, those who vote for the federal Conservative Party, vote for the Quebec Liberal Party provincially, because that's been the typical home for the Anglophones. There was a time where the QLP had 80% of Anglophone support, and while that figure has dropped significantly, it's still the favorite party amongst that group. What is your message to Anglophone voters who are feeling blindsided by the CAQ, who are dissatisfied with the current direction of the provincial Liberals with Dominique Anglade, but are also maybe hesitant about supporting a relatively new party?
Well, I tell them a few things. First off, you're not hostages as Anglophones of the Liberal Party anymore in Quebec. Why so? Because the debate has changed and shifted. This is not a referendum. The PQ is even lower than the Liberals right now. The two parties are melting down. We have a new reality. If you're center right, or if you like our idea, our openness vis-a-vis the Anglophone community, why don't you vote Conservative? It's a brand that you know. You've been voting Conservative at the federal level a few times in your lifetime, and it's something you can trust. We're growing among Francophones also. By voting Liberal, you're wasting your vote. They're fifth, distant fifth. They're lower than 10% among Francophones right now. Other than the Anglophones, the Liberals are going nowhere. And I don't think that the Anglophone community should vote for a fringe party. And I'm not just talking about the Canadian Party or Valorama's party. I'm talking about the Liberal Party, because the Liberal Party is becoming a fringe party in French Quebec. So they might not win one single seat where a strong French majority on October 3rd. So if you want to join a party that is doing as good, and that's very unique in Quebec's recent history, we are a party, the Conservative Party, that is doing as good among Francophones and Anglophones, and where our scores are probably are almost identical. And that's very, very good, because it means that we're not splitting on language anymore. We're uniting together for other issues, to lower your taxes, to exploit our natural resources, to give $200 per kid for their kindergarten per week to every parent, to add the contribution of the private sector to healthcare, and so on and so forth. These are the kind of propositions that resonate both in English and in French right now in Quebec.
For sure. To finish off, let's talk about your growth and your anticipation for this election. As you said, the Conservative Party of Quebec got 1.46% in the last election. You have pulled as high as 24% in second place in a lot of polls now. So what do you consider a win at this point? Is it just getting yourself elected? Would it be to have a small caucus, maybe opposition, or would a win be forming government? Like, what will you be satisfied with on October 3rd when the results come out?
There's different answers to that question. First off, if you asked me that question a year ago, I would have to tell you that it was just to get our names on ballots and find 125 candidates, because we wanted to make sure that people who disagreed with the government and the Liberals had a true option. That's been done. The next step now, we can be a little bit more optimistic, because the polls are very good. It resonates very well on the ground. As I said, we're the party that increased the most on every single front. We're the party with the biggest amount of donors right now in Quebec in 2022, and we're still going up. So our purpose is to get more well-known over the next 28 days, because that's what's left for this election campaign. And everything is possible at this point of time, honestly. But I'm not in politics just for an election. As I said when I announced that I was running for the leadership of the Conservative Party almost 2 years ago, my purpose is I'm going there for a decade. I think that there's a lot of reforms that we need to do. And this time, whatever we're going to get it's going to be a huge increase. I can guarantee you one thing. On October 3rd, when we're going to count the ballots, the party that is going to be the biggest winner of them all, no matter what the results are, we already know that it's going to be the Conservative Party. Actually, we already won. Just the fact that we're talking together, that we're getting a lot of media coverage, the fact that I will be at the leaders' debate, the two leaders' debate in French, is a proof that we went from a third party to a big national party, and that for me is important, and it shows that we're on the right path. And we have to look, yes, it's important in election, and I hope we're going to win, but I'm not thinking of the next election. I'm thinking of the next generation. And I want Quebecers to be like many other Canadian provinces and have a Conservative provincial party also to be part of their reality, because that's, there's a link that we can establish with English Canada. There's the Conservatives federally and even in other provinces have always been more decentralist, much closer to the average Quebec nationalist, and we didn't have anyone to talk to in Quebec. Those people couldn't talk to anyone in Quebec, because on one side there was the Liberals, who are centralists, who are Trudeau lovers, and on the other hand you have the separatists who don't want Canada to work. So the last thing they want is to unite with people who want to decentralize, to prove that Canada could work. So now we need a Conservative alternative that's in between, that wants to decentralize and is going to build bridges with other Conservative parties in Ottawa and in other provinces.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Eric, thank you so much for joining me today and for having this conversation. And I wish you the best of luck as you go around in your bus meeting with Quebecers across the province.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. À bientôt.
To see more of my interviews with Eric Duhaime, please see the description below. Unlike the legacy media, True North does not receive the federal government's media bailout. Hence, we rely on donations from people like you to keep our operations running. To make a donation, please visit donate.tnc.news. For True North, I'm Elie Cantin-Nantel.